At 71, I learned how quickly love can be priced. My own son chose money and left me standing alone. I said nothing, and that silence changed everything. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. It truly helps me feel less alone as I tell this story. My name is Margaret and I am 71 years old. I live in a small, quiet town in the United States, where mornings unfold slowly and the streets fall silent after sunset. It's the kind of place people choose when they believe the hardest chapters of life are behind them, when they expect peace to finally arrive. For most of my life I believed I had earned that peace. After decades of sacrifice, of giving everything I had to my family, I thought I would be allowed to grow old with dignity. I was a wife for 46 years. A mother for even longer. I built my entire identity around being dependable. I was the one who remembered birthdays, who kept emergency money tucked away just in case, who stayed quiet during arguments so the home could feel calm. When my husband passed away, I didn't fall apart the way people expected. I grieved privately. I rushed nothing, sold nothing, and leaned heavily on the one person I believed would always be there for me, my son. He was my only child. I raised him carefully, deliberately, always afraid of failing him. I worked extra shifts when he was young so he could attend a better school. I paid for tutors, sports fees, college textbooks. Later, when he married, I helped with down payments and medical bills. I never kept score. Mothers like me don't. We give and we tell ourselves that love doesn't need receipts. Before everything broke, my emotional state was simple. I was tired, yes, but content. I didn't need much. A warm house. Familiar routines. A few phone calls a week from my son. I told myself that the distance I sometimes felt was just adulthood, just life moving forward. I ignored the quiet ache that settled in my chest when my calls went unanswered or when conversations felt rushed. I told myself I was imagining it. My days followed a gentle rhythm. I woke early, made my tea the same way every morning, and sat by the window while the sun rose over the neighbors' trees. I kept a small notebook of expenses, not because I was struggling, but because I had learned long ago that security comes from knowing exactly where you stand. I cooked simple meals. I volunteered at the local library twice a week. And when my son needed help, financial or otherwise, I never hesitated. But little things began to change. Invitations arrived later or not at all. Decisions were made without me even when they directly involved me. Jokes were made about my old-fashioned thinking, usually followed by polite laughter that didn't quite hide the disrespect underneath. My daughter-in-law spoke to me kindly enough in public, but her eyes never softened. I noticed how conversations stopped when I entered a room. How plans were discussed in front of me as if I were a guest in my own life. So I stayed quiet. I believed patience was strength. I believed silence was grace. I didn't know yet that my silence would become my shield, and my son's undoing. After that morning, I began thinking more carefully about who I was and how I had arrived at this stage of my life. I was 71 years old. A widow, a mother, a woman who had spent decades placing her family's needs ahead of her own without hesitation or complaint. I had never thought of myself as weak. But I also never imagined I would reach an age where I would need to protect my place in the world. I believed that struggle belonged to the young, to those still building their footing. I truly thought my fighting years were behind me. I lived alone in the home my husband and I had bought more than 40 years earlier. Every corner of it carried memory. The shallow scratches on the kitchen table from hurried homework. The loose stair railing my husband always meant to fix but never quite got around to. The small garden out back that I still tended each spring, even though my knees protested more loudly every year. This house was never just property to me. It was proof of a life built slowly, carefully, and honestly. It was where I expected to remain for the rest of my days. My son knew that. He had grown up within these walls. He knew every sacrifice tied to them, every year of careful saving, every night of quiet worry. For most of his life he treated me with respect, or at least enough that I never questioned his intentions. When he married, I welcomed his wife without hesitation. I told myself that making space for her was part of being a good mother. I adjusted my routines, my expectations, even my words so she would feel comfortable. I wanted peace more than control. Harmony more than authority. Emotionally, I was in a fragile but hopeful place before the betrayal. Losing my husband taught me how quickly life could change, but it also taught me gratitude. I believed that as long as my son remained close, I could handle anything else. I didn't need constant attention. I didn't need praise or reassurance. I just needed to feel considered, to know I still mattered. Looking back now, I see how carefully I avoided conflict. When my son began calling less, I blamed myself for expecting too much. When he brushed off my concerns, I told myself he was busy, stressed, overwhelmed. When my daughter-in-law corrected me sharply or dismissed my opinions, I swallowed the embarrassment and smiled. I convinced myself that keeping the family together was worth the discomfort. That silence was the price of peace. But a quiet fear had begun to grow inside me. It surfaced late at night when the house was silent and my thoughts had nowhere to hide. I worried about becoming invisible. About being seen as an inconvenience rather than a mother. About what would happen when my usefulness ran out, when I no longer had anything left to give. I didn't share these fears with anyone. People assume that by a certain age you've learned everything there is to know about life. The truth is, aging doesn't make you fearless. It simply teaches you how to hide fear better. I hid mine well. I stayed polite. I stayed generous. I stayed quiet. I had no idea that the very qualities I believed made me safe, my patience, my restraint, my refusal to demand, were being quietly counted against me. And I had no idea that my son, the child I raised to value integrity, was already measuring my worth in numbers instead of love. My normal life before the conflict was quiet. So quiet it was almost invisible to anyone looking from the outside. I woke before sunrise not because I had to, but because my body no longer slept late. I made my tea, opened the curtains and sat at the small kitchen table where I had once packed my son's lunches. I liked starting my mornings slowly. It reminded me that time, at least for now, still belonged to me. I was careful with money but never fearful of it. Years earlier, after my husband passed, I learned how important it was to understand every detail of my finances. I paid my bills on time. I kept records neatly filed. I lived within my means. I didn't spend on luxuries, but I never felt deprived. Security mattered more to me than comfort, and I took pride in knowing exactly where I stood. Whenever my son called, I answered immediately. If he needed help, I listened. Sometimes it was emotional support, stress at work, tension in his marriage, worries he didn't share with anyone else. Other times it was financial. A short-term loan. Help with repairs. Assistance during a tight month. I never said no. I told myself this was what mothers did, especially mothers who still could. But slowly the tone began to change. Conversations grew shorter. My questions were met with sighs or half-answers. I noticed how often my son checked the time while talking to me, how quickly he ended calls once his request was settled. When I tried to talk about my own life, my health, my worries, my loneliness, the subject was gently redirected or quietly ignored. Family gatherings felt different too. I was no longer asked for my opinion. Decisions were announced, not discussed. When I offered advice, it drifted away like background noise. My daughter-in-law would smile politely, then turn away as if I hadn't spoken. Sometimes she laughed at my concerns, calling them old habits or unnecessary worries. My son never corrected her. He never defended me. He simply stayed silent. The red flags were subtle, but they were there. I just didn't want to see them. I told myself that respect changes shape over time. That adult children naturally pull away. That being less involved was part of letting go. What I didn't admit, what I couldn't yet face, was how small I was beginning to feel in my own family. There were moments that stayed with me long after they passed. Once I overheard my son joking with someone about how I was set for life and didn't need much anyway. Another time I was asked, casually, almost playfully, if I had ever thought about downsizing or simplifying things for the future. The words were light, but the meaning behind them made my stomach tighten, even as I forced myself to laugh. I began to sense that my value in the family was being quietly reduced to what I owned, what I could contribute, and what I might eventually leave behind. No one said it directly. No one had to. The silence spoke clearly enough. So I kept my routine. I kept helping when asked. I kept showing up with food, with checks, with patience. I believed that consistency would protect me. That loyalty would be remembered. I had no idea that behind calm conversations and polite smiles, my son was already making choices that would push me to the edge of everything I had spent a lifetime building. And I still had no idea how close I was to being forced to choose between my dignity and my silence. The betrayal didn't arrive in a single dramatic explosion. It came quietly, disguised as a reasonable conversation, wrapped in familiar voices and polite words. That was what made it hurt more than anything else. I was invited to my son's house one afternoon and told it was just a family discussion. Nothing urgent. Nothing to worry about. I remember standing in front of the mirror before I left, smoothing my sweater, telling myself not to feel nervous. This was my child. My family. We sat at the dining table, the same one I had helped them buy years earlier, the same one I had once imagined future holidays around. My daughter-in-law poured coffee but never looked up. My son cleared his throat in that careful way people do when they're about to say something they've practiced in advance. I felt it then, a tightening in my chest, a quiet warning I chose to ignore. He started talking about finances, about planning, about the future, about how things get complicated at my age. His voice was gentle, almost kind, as if he were offering guidance instead of taking ground. Then he mentioned my house. Not as my home, not as the place where he grew up, but as an asset. He spoke about it like something already in transition, as if it were slowly drifting away from me while I sat there listening. The words that followed still echo in my mind. He suggested that transferring certain things now would make life easier later. He talked about efficiency, about control, about what made sense for everyone. Everyone except me. When I hesitated, when I asked simple, reasonable questions, his patience began to thin. His voice hardened in a way I had never heard before, sharp and unfamiliar. My daughter-in-law finally joined in, her tone calm but practiced. She said it wasn't personal. She said this was just the smart thing to do. She looked at me like I was being unreasonable, like I was holding up a decision that had already been made. And my son, sat there nodding along with her. That was the moment I understood something I had been refusing to see. Money had replaced me in his priorities. I tried to explain what the house meant to me, how it held my life, my marriage, my memories. I told him quietly that I wasn't asking for much, just security, just respect, just a place to remain myself. He sighed, leaned back in his chair, and said words that changed something inside me forever. He told me I was being emotional, that I needed to think practically, that at my age I should be grateful he was looking out for me. No one defended me. No one asked how I felt. The room felt suddenly cold, even though the heater was running. I remember my hands shaking slightly as I wrapped them around my coffee cup, trying to steady myself, trying to hold on to something solid. I had never felt so small sitting across from my own child. When I didn't agree right away, the conversation ended abruptly. The warmth disappeared. I was no longer a mother. I was an obstacle. As I stood to leave, my son wouldn't meet my eyes. My daughter-in-law didn't say goodbye. I walked out with my dignity intact, but something inside me cracked. In that moment, I understood with painful clarity that my well-being mattered less than what I could provide. And for the first time in my life, I chose not to argue. I chose not to plead. I chose silence. The days after that conversation blurred together in a way I had never experienced before. I went home, closed the door behind me, and stood in the quiet of my living room as if I were standing in someone else's house. Everything looked the same. The furniture, the photographs, the familiar scent of old books and clean linen. But something felt wrong. I felt displaced, as though I no longer belonged anywhere, not even in the space I had built my life around. That night I didn't sleep at all. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every word, every look, every pause where I might have spoken differently. I questioned myself in ways I never had before. Had I failed as a mother? Had I been too giving, too patient, too willing to step aside? Or worse, had I made myself too easy to dismiss? The pain wasn't sharp or dramatic. It was heavy. It settled deep in my chest and refused to lift. In the days that followed, my phone stayed silent. No calls. No messages. When I finally reached out, my son's replies were short and careful, as if he were choosing each word with distance in mind. He said he was busy. He said we would talk later. Later never came. The space between us widened so quickly it left me unsteady, like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. I stopped mentioning the house. I stopped asking questions. On the outside I appeared composed. I still went to the library. I still watered my garden. I still smiled at neighbors and exchanged polite conversation. But inside I felt profoundly alone. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being dismissed by your own child. It doesn't scream. It whispers again and again that you are no longer needed. Every day I wrestled with myself. Part of me wanted to confront him, to demand respect, to remind him of everything I had given, everything I had sacrificed. Another part of me was afraid. Afraid of being labeled difficult. Afraid of pushing him further away. Afraid that if I spoke too openly, I would lose whatever fragile connection still remained. At my age, fear doesn't look the way it does when you're young. It isn't about starting over. It's about losing what little stability you have left. I worried about my home. About my independence. About what would happen if I became inconvenient. I had seen it happen to other women, slowly edged out of their own lives under the polite excuse of help. Some nights, I sat alone at my kitchen table with my hands folded, staring at nothing, caught between pride and survival. I had always believed silence was a weakness. Now it felt like my only shield. I told myself to wait, to observe, to protect myself quietly until I understood exactly what I was facing. What my son didn't realize was that my silence wasn't surrender. It was restraint. I was hurting, yes, but I was also paying close attention. And in that painful stillness, something inside me began to change. I stopped seeing myself as powerless. I began to recognize how much I still controlled. The more distant my family became, the clearer my thinking grew. The pain didn't disappear, but it sharpened my focus. I understood then that if I spoke too soon, I would lose everything. But if I waited, if I stayed silent just a little longer, I might finally protect myself in a way no one else ever had. What my family didn't know was that years earlier, after my husband died, I had learned a hard lesson about dependence. In the thick fog of grief, I became painfully aware of how little most people truly understand about their own lives, especially when it comes to money and control. I promised myself then that I would never be left confused or helpless. Quietly, without telling anyone, I began to educate myself. I attended free financial workshops at the community center, sitting in the back rows, listening more than I spoke. I asked careful questions at my bank, the kind that didn't draw attention but demanded clear answers. I read documents slowly, sometimes line by line, until every word made sense to me. When something didn't, I asked again and again. I wasn't preparing for revenge back then. I was preparing to survive. Years ago, on the advice of a kind attorney, I made decisions that seemed unnecessary at the time. I kept certain accounts solely in my name. I updated documents after my husband's passing. I made sure ownership was clear, protected, and legally sound. I didn't announce any of it. I didn't need approval or praise. I just needed peace of mind. As I sat alone in my kitchen during those quiet weeks after the betrayal, those decisions returned to me with sudden clarity. I opened the bottom drawer and pulled out a small folder, the one I hadn't touched in years. Inside were papers that represented more than money. They represented autonomy, security, proof that I had not been as unprepared as my son believed. I didn't feel excited. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. Instead of calling my son, I scheduled a meeting with the same attorney who had helped me years earlier. I walked into that office calm, composed, and prepared. I explained what had happened carefully, without drama or emotion. He listened quietly, then confirmed what I had already begun to understand. I was not nearly as vulnerable as my son thought. Nothing was out of my control. Not my home. Not my finances. Not my future. For the first time since that conversation at my son's table, I slept through the night. I didn't tell anyone about that meeting. I didn't change my behavior outwardly. I remained polite. Distant but polite. When my son eventually reached out again, speaking as if nothing had happened, I responded kindly but briefly. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I let him believe that time and pressure would eventually wear me down. Inside I was planning. Not out of anger but out of necessity. There is power in being underestimated, especially as an older woman. People assume age dulls your awareness. They mistake quiet for confusion. They see patience and think it means weakness. I let them believe all of it. Each day my fear loosened its grip. In its place grew something far stronger than anger: clarity. I understood then that protecting myself didn't require confrontation. It required timing. And for the first time I trusted myself enough to wait. The turning point didn't arrive with a phone call or a dramatic confrontation. It came quietly, one ordinary afternoon as I sat alone in my living room listening to the steady ticking of the clock on the wall. In that stillness I realized something that caught me off guard. I was no longer afraid. That realization surprised me. For weeks, fear had followed me everywhere. Fear of being pushed aside. fear of losing my home, fear of becoming invisible in my own family. But that afternoon, something inside me finally settled. I understood then that silence had given me something confrontation never could. Time. Time to see clearly. Time to think without emotion clouding my judgment. Time to decide what kind of ending I wanted, not just for this conflict but for this chapter of my life. I wasn't interested in humiliating my son the way he had humiliated me. I didn't want shouting matches or emotional scenes that could later be twisted against me. I wanted security. I wanted fairness. And more than anything, I wanted my dignity to remain untouched. So I made my decision. I stopped helping financially. There was no announcement. No warning. When my son asked for assistance with an expense a few weeks later, I answered calmly and said I couldn't help anymore. I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify my choice. I simply said no. The word felt unfamiliar on my tongue at first, almost uncomfortable, but it also felt powerful. Final. Unmovable. At the same time, I quietly activated the protections I had put in place long ago. I finalized documents. I clarified instructions. I made sure that no one could make decisions for me without my consent. Everything was done legally, cleanly, and carefully. I followed every rule. I left no room for assumptions, no space for pressure. Emotionally, the shift was immediate. The pain didn't disappear, but it no longer controlled me. I felt grounded, as if my feet were finally planted firmly beneath me again. I moved through my days with purpose instead of anxiety. I smiled more, not out of pretense but because I knew exactly where I stood. My son sensed the change even if he didn't understand it yet. His tone shifted when he spoke to me. The patience he once lacked returned, strained and uneasy. He asked questions I didn't answer. He made suggestions I politely declined. For the first time, uncertainty belonged to him, not to me. I stayed silent just as I had chosen. But this silence was different. It wasn't born of fear or confusion. It was deliberate, measured, strong. I knew then that whatever came next, I was ready. I had chosen myself, not out of bitterness but out of self-respect. And once that choice was made, everything else began to fall into place. The confrontation came sooner than I expected and not on my terms. It never is. It happened during a family gathering that was meant to be ordinary, a birthday dinner for a distant relative. I almost didn't go. Part of me wanted to avoid any place where I would have to pretend everything was fine. But another part of me knew that hiding would only confirm the quiet belief that I had something to be ashamed of. So I went. The room was already full when I arrived. Conversations paused just long enough for people to notice me, then resumed as if nothing had changed. I took my seat quietly, my posture straight, my hands resting steadily in my lap. Across from me sat my son. He looked confident, relaxed, almost smug. I could see it in his expression. He believed time had worked in his favor. He believed I had softened, that I had accepted my place. Halfway through the evening, the conversation drifted toward finances, casually as if it were harmless. Someone mentioned future plans, arrangements that would require coordination. My son picked up the topic easily, speaking with an authority that didn't belong to him. He talked as though decisions had already been made, as if my life were an open account that anyone could manage. That was when I spoke. My voice didn't shake. I didn't raise it. I simply corrected him. I said that nothing involving my home or my finances had been decided. I said that I was fully capable of managing my own affairs. I said it clearly, calmly, and without apology. The room went quiet. My daughter-in-law's smile disappeared instantly. My son looked at me as though I had violated some unspoken rule. He tried to laugh it off. He tried to redirect the conversation. But I continued, still composed. I explained that I had taken steps to protect myself, that everything was handled legally, and that any assumptions otherwise were incorrect. I didn't offer details. I didn't need to. The truth stated plainly was enough. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in my son's eyes. Real uncertainty. He asked questions I didn't answer. He glanced around the table, searching for support, but no one stepped in. The silence that followed no longer belonged to me. It belonged to him. I didn't stay much longer after that. I said my goodbyes politely and left. As I walked out, I felt something lift from my shoulders. Something I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. I hadn't exposed him. I hadn't embarrassed him. I had simply reclaimed my voice in a room where it had been ignored for far too long. And that was the moment the balance shifted completely. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly the way real consequences do, quietly, steadily, and without mercy. Within days of that gathering, my phone began ringing more often. Not with concern. Not with apologies. But with questions. Careful ones. Strategic ones. My son wanted clarity. He wanted reassurance. More than anything, he wanted control back. I gave him none of it. At first he tried to sound calm. He asked what I meant when I said everything was handled legally. I told him there was nothing to worry about and ended the call. The next time his voice was sharper, less controlled. He asked who I had spoken to, what documents I had signed, what changes I had made. I reminded him gently that my private matters were just that, private. After that, there was silence. Heavy, unsettled silence that lingered long after the call ended. Soon the tone shifted again. Frustration crept in beneath the politeness. I could hear it in the pauses before he spoke, in the way he repeated himself, hoping I might slip and reveal something. Then my daughter-in-law began calling too, something she had never done before unless she needed something. Her voice was sweet, almost cheerful, as if nothing had happened, as if the past weeks had simply been a misunderstanding. I listened. I thanked her for calling. I revealed nothing. What my son hadn't prepared for was the change in how others began to see him. Word traveled as it always does in families. People noticed that I was no longer deferring, no longer shrinking myself to keep the peace. They noticed that I was calm while he was restless. And in that contrast, something became clear to everyone. I was not the fragile one in this situation. Then came the financial pressure. The support I had quietly provided for years was gone, and its absence was suddenly impossible to ignore. Plans had to be adjusted. Expectations had to be lowered. My son had built his confidence on access to resources he no longer controlled. Without them, his certainty began to unravel. Legally, everything stood exactly where it should have, firmly in my hands. There were no loopholes, no leverage, no shortcuts. The reality my son now faced was simple and irreversible. He had misjudged me completely. Through it all, I remained composed. I didn't gloat. I didn't explain myself to extended family. I didn't seek validation or sympathy. I kept my routines. I lived my life. I slept peacefully. The power had shifted, not because I took anything from him, but because I stopped giving. And that loss, the loss of entitlement he never acknowledged, cost him far more than he ever expected. By the time everything settled, I understood something I wish I had learned much earlier in life. Peace feels different when it's earned instead of borrowed. My home was still mine. My routines were still mine. My future, however many years I had left, belonged to me alone. That realization brought a calm I had never known before, a quiet confidence that settled deep in my bones. My son did eventually come to see me. Not quickly and not easily. When he did, he didn't arrive with arguments or demands. He arrived with uncertainty. He spoke carefully, choosing his words the way people do when they realize the balance of power has shifted and they are no longer standing on solid ground. He said he hadn't meant to hurt me. He said he thought he was doing what was best. I listened without interrupting, without correcting him, without filling the silence. But something inside me had changed. I no longer felt the need to explain myself or soften the truth for his comfort. I told him calmly that choosing money over a parent always comes with a cost. Sometimes that cost is trust. Sometimes it's closeness. And sometimes, it's access to things you once assumed were yours by default. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him. I simply stated what was now true. He left quieter than he arrived. In the weeks that followed, my life grew smaller in the best possible way. Fewer worries. Fewer expectations. More clarity. I focused on my health, my home, and the friendships that had always treated me with respect. I no longer waited by the phone hoping for a call. I no longer felt obligated to prove my worth through generosity or sacrifice. What I gained wasn't revenge in the dramatic sense. It was something far more lasting: independence, safety, self-respect. At 71, I learned that strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it watches. And sometimes, it speaks only when necessary. I chose silence not because I was weak, but because I trusted myself to act when the time was right. And in the end, That quiet decision protected everything I had worked a lifetime to build. I didn't lose my son to money. He lost me the moment he chose it over love. When I look back now, I don't see myself as a victim anymore. I see a woman who learned, perhaps later than most, that love without boundaries slowly turns into permission to be used. I spent years believing that patience was the highest form of strength. What I learned at 71 is that patience must be paired with self-respect, or it quietly becomes self-erasure. I don't hate my son. That surprises people when they hear my story. Hatred would mean he still holds power over my emotions and he doesn't. What I feel instead is clarity. I understand now that people reveal who they truly are when they believe you have nothing left to offer. In those moments, the truth doesn't need to be forced. It simply rises to the surface. Age does not make a woman weaker. It strips away illusions. Teaches you what matters and what never did. I no longer measure my worth by how much I give or how quietly I endure discomfort. I measure it by how well I protect my peace. There are days when the silence between my son and me feels heavy. I won't pretend otherwise. But it is a clean silence, not the anxious, shrinking one I lived with before. This silence doesn't demand explanations. It doesn't ask me to apologize for existing. It simply gives me room to breathe. I wake up each morning knowing my home is safe, my choices are my own, and my future is not something anyone else can negotiate behind my back. That knowledge is a kind of freedom I didn't realize I had been missing for so long. If there is one thing I want other women, especially older women, to understand, it's this. You are not selfish for protecting yourself. You are not cruel for saying no. And you are never too old to reclaim your power. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't fight loudly. I chose silence, patience, and timing. And in the end, that choice gave me everything back. If any part of this story felt familiar, please know, you're not alone. Sometimes silence isn't weakness. It's the strongest choice a person can make. If you want more real emotional stories like this, subscribe to the channel. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Until next time, take care of yourself.